Good afternoon, everybody. Still enjoying Spacefest?
Yeah!
We really have put on a show this year. As the guy responsible for putting the panels and the speakers together, it's always a real thrill and a challenge to get something very unique, very different, very exciting to show to you. And when Michelle and I originally spoke about putting this together, literally hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, because it's one of those things that I grew up with that always got me excited about aviation. And it still staggers me that, you know, all of these decades later, it's still the fastest flown aircraft in history. It's a remarkable, remarkable machine. We are very, very fortunate on this panel today to not only have an exceptional group of people who not only worked on the X-15 but also flew it, but also as a moderator, somebody who knows this aircraft pretty much as well as anyone. A great friend, a great author. I'd like to present Michelle Evans.
Thank you so much for being here today. This is like a lifelong dream coming true today, to be with these guys and to share the story of the X-15 with all of you. I'm going to start out with a short introduction, and then we'll get into the questions. I've got a few questions myself, but I'd rather hear what you guys have to ask. So please feel free to ask as we get through here. Okay, thank you for coming to the first ever Spacefest X-15 rocket plane panel. The X-15 was the first winged rocket ship to take astronauts into space and back again. It was designed in the mid-1950s at a time when to the public, rocket ships meant gleaming silver stilettos with swept-back fins, filled with astronauts wearing bubble-headed spacesuits, doing battle against aliens bent on the overthrow or annihilation of Earth. Although the X-15 was sleek from a distant perspective, a closer look revealed construction much heavier than might be expected. Things such as bug-eyed cameras and antennae bulged from the heat-resistant Inconel X skin, while surfaces at the rear were corrugated for strength rather than aesthetics. Seeing the intricate details of the craft reminded one more of an industrial boiler rather than that of the sculpted visage people were used to seeing in the science fiction of that period. Yet the X-15 was still a beauty in its own right, not created to please an audience, but instead was the vanguard of a far-reaching research program that dealt with the real idea of being able to fly a fully reusable spacecraft out of the atmosphere and land it safely back on terra firma under a pilot's control. And even though the experimental data garnered from 199 flights by 12 pilots in more than 9 years of flight testing often lent itself to technical journals and scientific publications, the program also inspired people about the real excitement and promise of air and space exploration. This is where my own story starts with the X-15. My dad was an aerospace engineer who decided to take me with him on regular trips to Edwards Air Force Base, where the X-15 project was going full throttle. While my dad did his work, he would have friends take me through the hangars and out to the flight line to see what was happening. As a young kid, I was caught up in the excitement of a research flight test program going into space and back again that unfolded before my eyes. X-15 pilots like Scott Crossfield and Joe Walker and later Joe Engle were my heroes growing up. I rarely knew the names of those behind the scenes, but I knew that without people, like Crew Chief Charlie Baker, Operations Engineer Vince Capasso, Propulsion Engineer Wayne Ottinger, and North American Aviation Engineer Harry Shapiro, the X-15 would never get off the ground. I've been honored to get to know them all during my years of research and to be able to tell their stories in my book. I could not be prouder to be here today to let them tell you of their lives and what they did to help fly the first wings into space. With that, I want to open the discussion. I want to ask all the guys if you could do a quick introduction. Just tell us a little bit about yourselves and how you got involved with the X-15 program and what you thought of just being part of this really groundbreaking flight research program. So we'll start here with Joe Engle. And just to give you the full introduction, we have Joe Engle first. We have Charlie Baker, crew chief, second. Vince Capasso is here in the middle, followed by Wayne Ottinger and Harry Shapiro from North American at the end. So, yeah, we don't have name tags for everybody, so thank you very much. Joe?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, my name is Joe Engle, and my professional career was almost entirely with the United States Air Force. I wanted to be a pilot. I can't remember when I did not want to be a pilot. And to try and be the best pilot that I possibly could be, my sister had cut a little toy airplane out of a number 10 can, and I think it was long string beans or something can. And she cut it out with tin snips, and it turned out, I was really small at the time, and it turns out that the edges were so sharp, they still are. I still cut myself on this little thing. My mother wouldn't let me play with it, and I think it probably helped me want even more to be a pilot, to be around airplanes, because I couldn't have that toy. I had the opportunity I graduated from the University of Kansas with an ROTC degree, with an ROTC commission, and went almost immediately into the Air Force. I had to wait for an opening in a flight class. But once I got in the Air Force, I thought this is about as good as it gets. I had worked in a hangar in the evenings. I'd work 8 hours sweeping the floor, sorting nuts and bolts, cleaning toilets, you know what line boys do. And 8 hours of that for 1 hour flying time in a Cessna 120. And I thought I had a good deal then. When I got in the Air Force, I didn't have to pay for my flying. You didn't have to fill a gas tank up. I thought I was really in heaven then. And so I was able to fulfill my initial dream of being a fighter pilot and serve an operational tour before being accepted into the test pilot school at Edwards and getting to get into the flight test, which I really loved. My flight test wise, I think getting into the X-15 was a little bit of a surprise. Mike Collins and I were in the Aerospace Research Pilot School. We were graduating. NASA was ready to make another selection of astronauts. We all applied because that was that was a normal thing to do. And I had been called up to General Twig Branch's office, the commander of Edwards, and normally that means you've done something wrong. And so I was really scared witless, and walked into his office and was standing in a brace, and he said, sit down. And, which of course sounded like a good idea to me. I sat down and he said, and he picked up my application. He said, so I see you've applied for the astronaut program. And I said, well, yes, sir. I think we're all looking for a career. And he looked at the application and he just tore it in two, and he said, I don't think I'm going to approve this. And he says, I've got something else in mind for you, which was disappointing to me, but I didn't dare say anything right then. It turned out he wanted me to fly the X-15. He had me on to take Bob White's place on the X-15. And quite honestly, I've never regretted that switch over to that assignment. The X-15, very briefly, was by far the most professionally demanding and rewarding airplane that I have ever flown. I've had the privilege of flying 184 different kinds of airplanes, different types of airplanes. None of them, including the space shuttle, compares to the satisfaction of a pilot in flying than does the X-15, because it's a basic airplane. Cables that go around, pulleys and bell cranks back to the actuators and the surfaces. You get feedback, you feel the airplane, and you can communicate with the airplane. And I've never had regrets that I delayed my entry into the astronaut program in order to fly the X-15, nor will I ever, as far as I know. I've taken up more time than I should.
Oh,
thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Charlie.
I'm Charlie Baker. I was fortunate enough to be crew chief on X-15. I was an accounting major in college, and then Korea came up, and I enlisted in the Navy. Ended up as an aviation machinist mate, and fell in love with airplanes big time. So when I got out, I went and got an AMP license, and came down once for a show at NASA Dryden, and I asked them if there was summer work. Oh yeah, we're going to do it at one time. This year, we're just going to start. So I put in an application, they hired me for the summer, and towards the end of the summer, they asked me if I'd stay. And you bet, I'll stay. So I gave up going on into engineering and stuff and stayed and worked as on different airplanes, crewing different airplanes. And when I got there, all the X models were there. X1, 2, 3, and enjoyed working with the professionals, the old-time guys that know how to make airplanes fly, and had all kinds of different niches they taught you, and you got one, two. So then I was assigned to an X-15, and after the X-15, I went down and became the shuttle manager for the support office, the support shuttle landings before it, and I was up that way until I retired. But being part of the X-15 is being part of history. And I can't say enough how lucky I've been to be associated with the people and in flight research.
Thank you, Charlie. Vince?
I'm Vince Capasso. I got started with airplanes when my uncle came to visit when I was about 8 or 9 years old and brought me a model airplane, and that got me hooked. And many years later, when we were visiting, after both of us were retired, I told him, look what you got me into. But I went to Purdue, got my degree in aeronautical engineering, spent 3 years of flight test with the Air Force as a flight test engineer, and then worked for Convair on the Atlas missile testing, static testing for a couple of years. That basically got me qualified to work on the X-15 at NASA. And they hired me in to take care of the propulsion systems and, the related systems to that. And then when an opening came along, I got promoted to be the operations engineer in charge of one of the airplanes. And continued with that until the program ended. Basically, that's how I got into the program, and I thought it was the greatest airplane I'd worked on, and really enjoyed it.
Wayne?
I'm Wayne Ottinger. In the high school flying club in Phoenix, I started flying the rockets at age 16. Got my license as I turned 17. Cost me less than $300 because all the instructors were paid for on the school staff that we had inherited from the Chinese World War II training facility at Sky Harbor. But once I left University of Arizona here as a mechanical engineer in '55, I spent a few years with GE working on the J-79 before it ever flew. Was working in Evendale on the original 50-hour PFRT test to get it qualified to start flying. So after B-58-104 Rig 2 propulsion flight test, I started it on the X-15 in the early 1960. And about 2.5 years later, Vince came along and took over the propulsion end, and I went into the lunar landing research vehicle as project engineer. And I always am grateful for the X-15 experience because I figured that really qualified me to take on the Apollo lunar landing research and training vehicles. The latter, I was technical director for Bell after I switched hats in 1966, but I was extremely gratified to have been able to contribute at least some to the X-15 and finish up with Apollo.
Harry?
My name is Harry Shapiro. I always loved airplanes, starting out with capital models, making U-control and free flight airplanes as a kid. So after high school, I went into a school called College of Aeronautics. It was a school that didn't have any football team or basketball team or anything like that. It was strictly a technical school that taught you engineering and manufacturing. Not only did you know thermodynamics and aerodynamics, but you knew how to use a milling machine and a welder. Upon graduation, we had companies like Republic, Grumman, Lockheed, North American come out and interview us even before graduation. Engineers were really a commodity then. It was 1956. So I loved the F-100, so I went with North American, one of two people that came from my school in New York to work at North American. Because I was so familiar with the engineering techniques and ways, I didn't have to go through their indoctrination 2-week course they had. So I went right into flight test instrumentation. And right away, they assigned me an airplane, F-100C, ship 363. And my first job was to install accelerometers, in which I didn't know really what I was doing, but I did it. So by the end of that year, 56, this was August 56, by the end of the year, they said, we're going to transfer you. And I thought, whoa, you know, I'm just getting I was 20 years old. I was just getting I've never been away from New York. I'm in a strange place, and they're going to transfer me again. Wow. So they said, we're going to go into this new group, the X-15. And here, I was elated because the group was filled with the best of the best engineers from North American aviation, the people that really knew airplanes. So I was really lucky. I was really fortunate to be with them. And again, it was a project group where not only did we design the circuits, but we designed the installations too. So we had the opportunity to prepare drawings, buy the equipment, see the equipment being built, and then actually seeing it fly. So we had a great opportunity there. I was there from the beginning of the program to the end of the program. And I used a lot of the information I learned from all these top engineers and scientists on my future. I spent 35 years with North American Aviation. Never was tempted to leave the company at all, either way. So I really had a good career there. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. I want to start out with a quick question here to Joe. On your very first flight, you did something that only one other X-15 pilot did, and I think you got in trouble for what you did. Could you tell us about what happened that flight?
I'm getting help from the audience here. Yeah, I did a roll.
Oh, yeah.
The first flight of the airplane, when a new guy was assigned to the program, and this was my first flight in the X-15, you would launch from under the B-52. You'd only go to half throttle. The first flight was restricted on speed and altitude and acceleration, just so you weren't too overcome with it, because it was a dadgum impressive airplane to fly. It's the best airplane I've ever strapped into. But you go at half throttle, you climb up and start to push over and level off at about 70,000 feet. And I believe on that first flight, I think I got up to about Mach 4, I can't remember, but something like that. Very benign for the X-15, faster than I've ever been and higher than I've ever been before.
Mach 4 is benign, right?
The purpose of the flight was to let the new guy, the new pilot, get familiar with flying the airplane, communicating with the airplane, seeing how it responds to different inputs, how fast and how hard you have to make inputs into the stick and the rudder. So that's what I was doing, and I was just elated at how beautifully responding the X-15 was in this Mach number and altitude environment. It was really at home in the air. And I was banking and back and forth and sort of maneuvering back and forth and feeling it out with some pitches and pitch inputs to see what the response was in all axes. And about that time, Bob Rushworth, who was on the ground control, watching the radar track over the ground and profile, said, okay, Joe, you're in good shape energy-wise, but it's about time to look out the window and start setting up your approach for landing. We didn't have a guidance system in the X-15. It just eyeballs out the window was your guidance. So I looked out the window and as I rolled up one way and saw the dry lake bed at Edwards, and it, honest to God, it looked at me like the sucker was just scooting, just flying underneath me. And I thought, God, I'm going to overshoot this. I'm going to overshoot the field. And Neil, not too long before that, had come back on an altitude flight and skipped back up and then almost overshot. In fact, he ended up over Burbank, turning to try and stretch the glide back into Edwards. That was kind of in my mind. I thought, I'm going to do it. Be another Neil Armstrong. I'm going to go down and tour LA and watch watch the people out there and suck it back to Edwards. Wasn't that bad a deal. I did not want to go push it over to a negative angle of attack because we knew in the simulator that there are some surprises that can happen if you do that. So in seeing how great it handled, I was rolled up, I saw the field down here, I just pulled it over and sucked the nose down to get down into the more dense area where it gets the speed brakes out and slow down, and continued to roll around and set up the pattern and landed. I didn't think a thing about it. One of the guys we were going for the debrief. I can't remember who it was that kind of came up alongside me as I was walking down the hallway, and he said, "Hey, did you roll that sucker?" And I didn't even think about it. I couldn't, to be honest with you, I wouldn't have remembered. I was walking about on 4 inches of air before that time. I was so excited about flying. And I said something like, "Who, me?" And he said, "I didn't think so," when we walked on in the debrief. Well, at that time, we didn't have real-time telemetry. The guys in the control room couldn't see what your roll attitude was. All the data was recorded on board on oscillographs. It took several days to stream out the oscillograph and plot out the data to see what the whole parameters were. And so that was all that was said, and I didn't mention anything to it in the debrief. And several days later, they had developed the film from the bug-eye camera that looked out the back. I don't know how long it took to do that, but it wasn't very long. And it was pretty obvious that the airplane had rolled, whether I knew it or not. The airplane had done rolled. And so I had to go to my supervisor in fighter test operations and Bob Rushworth, and he said, "Hey, did you roll that airplane?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess I did." He said, "Well, why'd you do that?" And I explained to him that I thought I was going to overshoot, so I wanted to get the nose down into the thick, fat air again. And he said, "Well, okay." He said, I'd have done the same thing, but you need to go see General Branch about this. So I went back to the General Branch's office again and was standing there for forever, it seemed like it, at a brace. And he was sitting reading a bunch of other papers, and pretty soon he picked one up and he said, "Well, did you roll the airplane on your first flight?" I said, "Yes, sir, I think I did." And he said, "Well, why?" And I explained to him the whole situation. He said, "Well, I'd have done the same thing, but you got to go down and see Mr. Bickle down there." So I went down to Paul Bickle, who fortunately was an excellent glider pilot, a world-class glider pilot who held several altitude records in gliders. And Paul was kind of the same kind of a manager. Remember he had that white shirt and his gut kind of stuck out a little ways, and a cigar. And you'd sit there with that cigar, and the cigar ashes would fall off on his shirt. You wanted to get up and go over and brush it.
It's good you didn't catch on fire.
You didn't dare do that, Paul. And so finally he looked at me and said, "Well, Engle, did you roll the airplane?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I did." He said, "Why'd you do it?" I explained to him. He said, "Well," he said, "I'd have done the same thing, but don't do it again because everybody's going to want to do it." So it was something that I've never been ashamed of, but I would think very carefully about for the rest of the program. I never rolled it again during that.
Just two guys did it. Scott Crossfield did, and on his first flight, and Joe got away with it on his first flight, and everybody else knew better because they didn't want to go through that chain of command.
They turned the data switch off.
That's right. I didn't know enough about out the airplane yet to think about turning the date switch on. I should have done it.
There you go.
Now you tell me.
Let's go back for a redo.
Yeah.
Or more reflight. Charlie, when the X-15 was being prepared for flight, everyone was out on the lake bed pretty early in the morning, usually in the dark and stuff. Can you tell us what it was like being out there preparing the X-15 for flight?
It'd be a little dark 30, and if you want to be cold, go to the desert when the sun comes up. In November, December, it is cold. But the crew would come in, we would service the airplane with LOX and ammonia, peroxide, helium, nitrogen, LN2, and get all the elements in the airplane. And during that time when you put it, it's all cold, so the hydraulics would freeze in the tunnels. So someone would have to sit in the cockpit and with the hydraulic machine hooked up and keep moving the controls so we'd have a flow of hydraulics so they wouldn't freeze before takeoff, because they'd thaw on the climb out with the B-52. And most of the time we didn't have any problem. It was set. You just did your thing and put panels on, took panels off, like normal aircraft mechanics, and then you'd, after taxi and B-52 would take off, usually ended up chasing it down the runway in case they stopped and you had to get the pilot out, because we had a platform on the pickup with you could get out on if need be. And then we'd go out to the lake bed and wait for launch and see if they could find the lake bed.
Good thing to do. How about after they landed? What was your job after they landed?
After it landed, it was all fun. No, we'd go out and the airplane didn't have any wheels. It had skids. So we had a dolly that you put underneath the rear of it, and you could jack up and get the skids up off the ground, and we hook a tow bar to the front and air up the strut and get a little more air in the strut and tow it back in. And then we'd have to purge all the commodities that we'd put on. We got to purge them off before we could put it in the hangar.
Vince, you told me about an incident. You used to, the X-15 pilots needed a visual cue when they were coming down, and you would usually go out and drop smoke canisters out there so they could tell which way the wind was blowing and stuff. So you gave them that visual cue. Now you helped, by lighting off these smoke canisters on the lake bed for them. And you told me about how exciting it got, especially with Jack McKay. Tell us about how that was.
Well, we had these smoke grenades we'd throw. I think it was at high key to mark the touchdown point. And you'd have a pretty good cloud of smoke. Jack often landed short ahead of the smoke, way down the runway from where we'd marked. Well, we had to get the carryall out of the way, away from the runway. But you had the smoke kind of obscuring it, so we'd come out from behind the smoke very slowly, looking to see where the airplane was. And more than once we found Jack on the side and the direction, on the side that we were going, and you couldn't steer the airplane once it's on the ground. There was no nose wheel steering. So one time I recall, I wasn't driving, Merle DeGear was driving. We snuck around, he was over far enough, we were afraid if we went that direction to get away, we'd get in front of him. You don't want to do that. So we made a U-turn to go back across the active runway on the lake bed. You really didn't want to do that either, but we had to get out of the way. We also had to carefully look and make sure there wasn't one of the 104 chase planes that was going to touch down in that area before we got away.
I'm glad he didn't land on top of you. That would have made a bad day. Very bad
Yeah.
day. Yeah. Wayne, X-15 pilot Milt Thompson wrote in his book about an incident where you and crew chief Larry Barnett had a narrow escape from a cloud of toxic rocket fuel. Would you care to elaborate about what happened that day?
Well, I'll try to shorten the story.
Yes.
We had ground support equipment failure on capturing the vent of the ammonia tank, 1,400 gallon. It had rained that day and there was a puddle of water down in the bottom of the pillbox I was in. We were over on the left side of the airplane near the engine, and we'd had emergency shutdown on the engine, and before we could consider even restarting it, we had to send the two fully suited inspectors, one of Charlie's mechanics out with oxygen bottles on them and full suits on to inspect it for leaks. And so Larry was standing up on top of the ladder in the pillbox. I was down in the bottom of it. And this malfunction in the capturing equipment off the vent system put a big cloud of ammonia, and it's 90%, and it was going for water. And that's where I was. Well, it hit Larry. I think he probably had his 3% mask on. But anyway, he fell on top of me. And as he was coming down, I flipped the 3% mask over my headset, plugged into the comm connector in the bottom of the pillbox. So as I remember the story, he and I passed each other about 4 or 5 times up a 7-foot ladder. So we come out of the top and we're headed out away from the airplane, away from that cloud of ammonia. We can't breathe. And I'll tell you, when you can't breathe, you're motivated. And we're leaping into the air as far as we can, every other stride trying to get a breath. Well, after about 100 feet, I come to the end of my comm cord, which was under my filter mask. And the connector just sheared off the wall. And I did a complete, I laid out horizontal in the middle, but I never missed a stride. I continued to do a flip and never missed a stride. But all of this was witnessed by Milt Thompson, along with the executives from Frank Sinatra's film company, because in a week or two they were going to start filming the X-15 movie, where they were given a whole week in our operation to shoot it. And it was Charles Bronson with his leading lady, Mary Tyler Moore, in their first movie, 1961. So Milt had to explain what was going on, and in his book 30 years later, he did a pretty good job of describing it until he got to the point of claiming that Larry and I had run through the rocket blast because the engine was on. And so that was a little embellishment, if you want to say. But anyway, that was, and I was able to get into that X-15 movie on mission control. And so I show my grandkids how I co-starred with Mary Tyler Moore.
You guys all didn't know we had a
like
Hollywood
two
star.
gazelles running along, one ahead and then ahead.
Harry, I understand that you were in the cockpit of the X-15 for a checkout one day, and you thought you might be ejected. Can you talk about that one?
Yeah, every day, see, we, engineering and the airplane were right next to each other. So at lunchtime, when everybody was gone from the shop, I would love to sit in the airplane, just pretend I was a pilot. And one day they had an injection seat in there. And I climbed in and sitting there playing around with the instruments and stuff. And I proceeded to leave, and I pulled my feet back into the seat, and all of a sudden 2 arms grabbed me around my ankles. And I couldn't release them. I didn't know what was going on, and I look up, and there's the ceiling of the building, and there's a "Don't remove before flight" flag stick on in the seat. I'm thinking, wow, did I activate the ejection system? And the shop was empty at the time, and I was kind of embarrassed to call for help. Finally, some mechanic came by and I said, hey, do you know how to get out of this seat? And he said, oh yeah, there's a little button on the front of the handrest there. Just push that down, it will release you. But that was part of the ejection system for a pilot. You pull your feet back and you cross your arms and out you went, you know. Luckily, we never had to use it.
Thank you, Harry. I'd like to definitely open it up to you guys, what you'd like to talk about. We have a microphone here in the center aisle, so anybody that would like to come up and ask some questions, please feel free to queue up and let us know what you guys want to talk about as well.
Michelle, could I make one
Sure.
quick comment? It's something I should have said up front, and something you probably sensed. These guys all are so compatible, such good friends, and they worked together, they knew each other. This X-15 program was by far the greatest, most rewarding thing that I could have ever done in my life. And the reason was that the X-15 team was made up from people from all different companies and organizations, like NASA, the Air Force, North American Aviation, Rocketdyne Motors, companies and corporations that supported the X-15 operation. Out on the flight line, they were all paid by different companies, but when working together, you wouldn't know who anybody worked for. They could have swapped badges. The badge that they wore didn't make any difference. If something needed to be done, you wouldn't say, go to your supervisor, and he'll go to my supervisor, and they'll send the paperwork down. It was a help out where you needed to help out, work together as a team, completely from top to bottom, from start to stop. I think even as a very, very young Air Force officer, I recognized and I saw that, and I appreciated what a team like that really meant to have behind you to get your airplane ready. So you see that on the stage. These guys work for different companies, but you never know it. You think they all came from the same shop.
I know that's one of the things that was really striking to me when I was out there doing these interviews over these years, that every guy that I talked to, the X-15 was just the most amazing thing to be a part of, and it was truly a family. It was a family then, it's a family now. These guys still do reunions together. You still, like once a month or something, I think you guys still get together as much as you can for those who are still local. And they still keep in contact after all these years because they were not just part of the team, but part of a family. And it's what really makes this such a special story. So.
And gotchas are the name of the game with this crowd too, believe me. Even today, you walk out, with your back against the wall, really watching, because somebody's going to get you.
Yes, our first question.
Okay. Dave Scott has said that the simulators at Edwards were set to run at faster than normal speed. Can you talk a little bit about your perception of time at hypersonic speed?
Yeah, I'll take a first crack at that. Yeah, a lot of simulations were run at faster than normal speed deliberately in order to force you to go through the routines of what you were going to do, whether it was responding to a failure or something. That's not uncommon in simulators to do that. That makes it so that on flight day, when you're flying and things happen, even small anomalies happen, they seem to happen in slow motion, and you're taking care of them, and you're waiting for the next thing to happen, which really is a good practice. And it may have been started on the X-15 simulator because I think that was one of the first really good simulators that was used for training pilots and systems operators and things like that. But yes, we ran a lot of times faster than normal speed. And then that made flight days seem like a walk in the park.
And they carried that over into the shuttle training?
They carried that over into shuttle training, yeah.
Right. Next.
First, I'd like to say thank you very much for being here and giving us a glimpse into a truly historic program. My question is, how much of the X-15 technology and experience wound up in the SR-71 program?
I think I can probably answer that. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's zero. I really do. I know Kelly Johnson was sort of disparaging of the X-15 because he said, you know, it doesn't have an operational mission. It was built by a different company. The X-15, I'm sorry, but from my personal standpoint, it left the SR-71 in the dust. No, it did not fly spy missions over Russia, but it was never meant to do that as well. But, you know, everybody always thinks about, I get people all the time, the SR-71, well, that was the fastest aircraft that ever flew. Sorry, the X-15 was over double that speed, so there's no way. Anybody else would like to?
You know, one thing I might add is when we were designing and building the X-15, we were told to buy 3 parts for the aircraft and 2 spares. And we would write these engineering purchase requests to do it, and that's what the order would say. But a double order would come in. Okay, so we would put that in the stock room, and when we were looking for those parts, they weren't there. And we couldn't figure out where they were going. We found out later they were going across the way to the SR-71.
All right, well, I just have to say first that the X-15 has been my favorite airplane since I've learned of its existence. It's just amazing. Mr. Ottinger, I had the pleasure of running into you in the coffee line this morning, and you hinted about a story with the XLR-99.
Well, in the early days, the nozzle in the chamber was falling off the rock-eyed ceramic coating, and after a little bit of operation, it started leaking ammonia fuel into the main chamber. And so we're facing a pretty serious problem because it was happening pretty much on all the engines, and there was no real repair capability at the manufacturer in New Jersey, Reaction Motors, in the sense that they applied that ceramic through a rod-fed system, and that was zirconium oxide, and they did it before the injector was ever welded onto the chamber. And so if you wanted to send something back to the factory and get it repaired, they'd have to cut the injector off of the chamber and use the old rod-fed method. And so there was another research engineer assigned to me, and we were both to go out and explore new processes for ceramic coatings. And early on, we discovered the research labs, 4 or 5 of them that we visited, were fooling around with plasma arc deposition. And this meant you could go with powders. And I immediately saw the prospect where we could get the nozzle of that small plasma arc gun through the throat. And I came up with a concept of doing a field repair, which turned out to be 1 week. And we made a pantograph machine out of a jet engine roller stand and mechanized the engine all wrapped in plastic. And we tried to get a patent on this machine after it was all done, and it was rejected because in 1928 there was an incandescent frosted light bulb patent for a similar pantograph machine to coat that light bulb. But we did make it work and demonstrated it, turned it over to the Air Force, and I think it took us a couple of months, so 7 days a week, 12 hours, with about 10 of us, counting myself, in the shop, and we got that delivered, and I think we doubled the amount of burn time that we could get out of those chambers after that coating, and we could do it with a 1 week repair in the field.
The ammonia, there were tubes in that engine where you were talking about. You pumped ammonia fuel through it to help cool the chamber, and plus make it where when you went into prime, you had a full fluid going into when you lit off. Is that right?
That's right, and the beauty of the plasma arc, we could put in gradated coatings, starting with pure metal at the stainless steel tube, 3/8 inch diameter, carrying that ammonia, and then we could layer a few mils of ceramic, and then build out to a pure ceramic at the flame front, and maybe 5 or 6 layers. And with that, it lasted maybe twice as long. The Air Force had to fine-tune it after we delivered it to them and demonstrated it. but it worked out very well. And I thought we did a good job of making more engines. We only had 8 flight engines to support 3 airplanes. You couldn't afford to burn chambers out very much.
Yeah, thanks. We really appreciate that.
Well, you only used them for a minute and a half.
I know. Hey, you gotta remember, the LR-99 only ran for 90 seconds until you got to the X-15A2, and then you could run an extra minute on there. We'll talk about that more a little bit later too, I'm sure. Next.
I'd like to second what you said earlier, and thank you very much for this glimpse into history. It's really awesome. And this airplane is the reason I became a pilot, and the dream, and everything started for me. And I have 57 airplanes under my belt, Joe, so I got some catching up to do. Two-part question here, Charlie. I found it very interesting about the hydraulics and how you had a guy sitting in there to keep everything going. In flight, when the aircraft was attached to the wing of the airplane, did we have to do that same thing during that time too? Did you recall actually exercising the hydraulics?
Oh, yeah.
You had to do that?
After they took off, no. Because you didn't have hydraulics. After we pulled a hydraulic machine off, we didn't have hydraulics until we started APUs.
Okay, okay, I see.
The APU gave you electricity and hydraulic power, and you didn't start that until just before lunch.
Any other common sense things like that about exercising things? Anything unique to your job as a crew chief that you could bring to us that was kind of interesting and common sense? It's like exercising the hydraulics, or anything else like that?
One thing I'd like to mention, the 2-stage igniter got going and provided 800 pounds of thrust through that 2-stage igniter. And then after it dropped off the hooks, you only had one ball valve to open to get the main chamber going. But I thought that was, and we did have igniter pressure transducers line exploding in flight and on the ground. And we had a misdiagnosis. One was, it was blamed on bad batch of lock-safe lubricant used to assemble the engine. So they went in and tore down every engine. And it cost us quite a lot of time to do that and then rebuild all the engines. And then it wasn't until they had one of the ground test engines explode in the test stand that they were forced into getting the right diagnostics and getting it fixed. But I did insist on Rebel and his machinists to fabricate some interesting spherical type pieces that could be all assembled and clamped in place to try and give some protection, because Bickle would not ground the airplane.
No.
The other question I had was propulsion in New Jersey. Did you guys ever visit New Jersey, Picatinny Arsenal, for the testing there? I was a very, very young person, but we heard the testing. I went to school 3 miles from that test stand, and 3 miles away, it was so loud that it would just shake and rattle everything. Were you guys there?
Well, it was June of '60, and I'd just been on board about 5 months when Razkowski, our chief of maintenance, and John Reeves, an inspector, and myself spent a whole month in school in New Jersey at the RMI plant. And that was during the time that Scottsfield was shot across with the explosion in number 3. And so when I got back, I was assigned to do independent investigations in spite of the fact that they were getting a direct pipeline from Bob Fields, who knew a lot more than I did, but I cut my teeth on that and had to learn how to operate in that environment in order to find out what caused that on the pressure regulator and relief valves in the ammonia tank.
Yeah, I think all of the rocket shop guys did go to reaction motors to get their training there.
No, I just think it was just the 3 of us.
Oh, just the 3 of you?
Yeah.
Okay. So you brought their training back and then trained the
Yeah.
other guys underneath you? Okay, great.
The rest of us had to learn the hard way.
The rest of us had to learn the hard way, yes, absolutely.
Well, thanks again on behalf of all of us for coming down here today. We actually have one of the B-52s here in Tucson, NB003, and I was so impressed by the complexity of the pylon and all the connectors to the ammonia, helium, all that good stuff. So if you guys want to check out one of the drop planes, go ahead and go out to the Pima Air Museum. That's really an awesome experience. And 008's out in Dryden. Bill Dana retired from NASA, and he was kind enough to take a short interview for me that morning. And of all the great things that he did, I just want to let you guys know he just had total love for all of you guys, and asked what his greatest accomplishment in life was, and he says to have you guys working with this team. And my question's very brief. There was also a lifting body program out there, the HL10, M2, X-24. Did you have any interaction with that program, any cross-connect? And what would you like to say about any of your, except for losing Mike Adams, about any part of your crew that you've lost over the years? Do you have any memories of them? Thank you.
I just want to say something about ship 003. I don't know if everybody knows this, but Boeing used that airplane as a drop test airplane to test its landing gear. And I realized, wow, we got an airplane that's already fatigued, and we're going to carry an X-15 on that. I think 008 was another one that you could only fly it so many hours, and then you had to almost rebuild it and resurface it all the time. And with the lifting bodies, we worked on a proposal, North American worked on a proposal to what we call Bilka's bathtub. And we didn't get the contract. Northrop, I think, got the contract.
I loaned the lifting body one of them that wanted instant lift, so I gave him some of my LLRB 500-pound rockets out of our stock, and then they reordered replacements, but they stuck that little 500-pound peroxide rocket on the back end, and the pilot, right near flare out, could give himself a little extra boot.
Vince, did you have any connection with the lifting body program after the X-15?
Well, not directly. I did do some work. I remember looking at the wiring diagrams for the wiring of the aircraft. Even though my degree was in aeronautical engineering, I got into ham radio, so I had an understanding of circuits and that actually was valuable in putting some of the understanding of some of these systems work, be able to understand both the electrical and as well as the mechanical and the propulsion end of it. But I remember they putting the rockets in the back of the lifting body. They called that instant L over D. If his flare wasn't going right, he could fire that rocket and get himself out of a bad situation. Yeah, it was just a very short interval.
It was like reaction controls. It had very fast response.
One thing about lifting body, it didn't, it was still the old cables and linkage and the fly. It was built like a small airplane, really. It wasn't anything fancy in those lifting bodies. And another thing on the X-15, the B-52 carried locks aboard also, and we kept topping off the liquid oxygen in the X-15 during flight and shut her down just before launch.
I just want to make a quick comment about Pima too. Definitely recommend if you haven't been out there to get out there. My understanding is 003 is still under restoration. I'm not sure when that's all going to be completed and stuff, but you can still see it behind the fence there. Looking forward to having that back out on final display. But they also have one of only two mock-ups that I'm aware of the X-15, a full-scale mock-up of the X-15. And I just found out recently, I hope this is true, but the guys out there told me that that mock-up also is the one that was used in the movie X-15. So that one, if you go out there and see it, you can imagine Charles Bronson sitting there in the cockpit of that at one point. So it's really great to go out there. They've got a really nice facility, and I definitely highly recommend going out to Pima if you get the chance. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if any of you had any Neil Armstrong stories.
Any Neil Armstrong stories?
I got a couple.
Go for it.
He had been flying our LLRV in Houston before we could get the lunar landing training vehicles going. And I had switched hats and went to work for Bell, getting those up and upgraded to Apollo hardware. But we started out the LLRV with center stick and rudder pedals. And it wasn't long before Dean Grimm decided that we'd better start getting ready for some real training. And he snatched a sidearm out of Gemini 6A, which was the first successful rendezvous on Gemini. And he sent it to me before it went in, the capsule went into the Smithsonian. And Rebels Machine Shop did a great job of putting in our particular resolvers and so forth in place of the ones used in the Gemini control system. So Neil was flying this in Houston when we shipped it down there, when we got done with our research flying. And he had to eject. And that was another whole story I won't get into, but right after the ejection, we were debriefing him. And he started losing control of his speech. And he never realized that he bit his tongue through that ejection. And it was swelling up on him, and he couldn't control his speech. And the end of that story is that when the crane picked up the wreckage, snake crawled out from under it, half burned. And, but that, the other story that connects with old Jack Kluber, Neil and I were watching the upgraded ejection seat test, which was a 0-0 test. And there was a small mistake, so the dummy's boot caught the corner of the instrument panel. So the seat came out and started doing all kinds of crap. But it was still a successful ejection. Neil saw that gyration and slammed the door and took off in the black and white wagon, getting back up to the North Base. But anyway, there was a nice photo of everybody walking with their backs towards the dummy who was face down in the dirt. And so I put a big caption on that for old Jack Kluber, and I said, oh, well, he was just an Army pilot. And so, anyway, these are, and it's true about the practical jokes. We had one mechanic down there at the South Base at about 10 degrees out there early in the morning, and the crew got, when he got into the porta potty at 10 degrees, they put the forklift under it, put him up in the air about 30 feet.
Joe, Neil was gone by the time you got there, right? He'd already left for the astronaut office when you started on the X-15?
Right.
Okay. But you certainly got to work with some of the other pilots, primarily Bob Rushworth. You were the second pilot behind him when he was flying prime. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yes, and one thing I'd like to insert about Neil. Neil was so quiet, and people thought he was kind of a recluse, I think, at times, because he really was. He was quiet. He was hard to engage in conversation, and I even asking him questions that you really wanted the answer to, like flying, like going to the moon, and stuff. He was very, very timid and quiet about it. But man, I mean to tell you, all you had to do around Neil was mention X-15 or Piper Cub or Ronka. And he was like a kid on a sugar high. He'd start talking. He loved the X-15. He loved the X-15 program. And I think everybody that knows Neil will agree with that.
one thing about Neil, when he was your project pilot, we were flying 104, we had a fiberglass wing on, we were doing some laminar flow testing. And Neil would come down in the hangar by the airplane and explain everything that we were going to, why we were doing this test or that test, and how, which made it a lot easier to take the airplane. But the trouble with Neil is sometimes if you tell him don't hit that switch, he's going to hit it. So the best thing you could do was take a wire off the back end of the switch.
Yeah, I'll say when I got to sit down with Neil, it was really an amazing experience because when I first wrote to him and asked about coming to talk to him and doing an interview, I wasn't even sure if I'd hear back from him because obviously the first man on the moon, everybody wants to talk to Neil, right? But it's like, yeah, I was literally walking out the door to go to work one morning and I got a phone call and I pick it up and it's like, hi, this is Neil. And I was like, oh, I expected to get a letter back from his secretary or something. He called me directly and is sitting there basically interrogating me on the telephone to make sure I knew what the heck I was talking about before he would agree to come in and do an interview or something. But the whole thing too was, you want to talk about the X-15? Nobody ever asked me about the X-15. Everyone's like, how did it feel to walk on the moon or whatever? It's like, no. And when we sat down to talk, it was just really great. And it was, as you said, he was talking about something that he really wanted to talk about. He was the consummate engineer. He often talked about, he was an engineer before he was a pilot. He was a pilot to test out the engineering on things. That would seem to be his real goal in life, is more in the engineering. I think that's why they have the engineering school at Cleveland named after him. And he was very unassuming. Yeah, people really did. They thought he's a hermit or something. No, they think that he was just, very antisocial. No, he was shy. He didn't like crowds. I'm sorry, but I think he was the best first man on the moon.
He could chug a lug of beer better than anybody.
Yeah.
But he bailed out over Korea on the F9.
Yeah.
And he was doing a study on the way down before he pulled the chute. With one arm out, he'd roll back, stop, put his feet out. He was telling me the story, and said, you can really do this, And so I guess he was one of the first skydivers too.
I'd like to remember the Regalo wing on the little bicycle kind of thing, and just a stick out there in front to control it. I think it was
Milt flew that.
Yeah, Milt, and then Grissom rolled over it, testing it. But then it went to some lifting body stuff that started out with plywood and a Pontiac. They'd soup up the Pontiac and tow that out as fast as it could go, 89 miles an hour under tow, maybe 100 miles an hour under tow. But then it went from there to a Goody Bird, towing it up to 10,000 feet, and then from there to the B-52 supersonic lifting body.
Harry, I want to ask you, did you ever get a chance did these pilots ever come down and visit you guys down in North America?
Well, I worked right with Scott Crossfield, and if you knew Scott, he was a different type of person. If you really want to know about Scott, read There's Always Another Dawn. But Scott was, the first time I met Scott, he was sitting in my airplane during my lunch hour and smoking. And I didn't know it was Scott. I saw this guy sitting in there, and I yelled at him. First, I was mad because he was sitting in my seat. And second of all, he was smoking in a cockpit that was under manufacturing. And I explained to him, you're getting all your ashes and stuff in the open lines here, and you're going to contaminate the wires. And he apologized, said, I'll never do it again. And I went up, and I happened to be talking to Charlie Feltz. He was a chief engineer on the program. And I said, yeah, there was this guy smoking in the cockpit down there. He says, that was Scott Crossfield. And I said, oh my God. here I am, 21 years old, yelling at a test pilot. And a couple days later, I see these signs in the shop, no smoking around the aircraft. And I think Scott was the one who enforced that.
I hear you painted lines around the aircraft and everything. They said, no, don't get close. Yeah, no smoking.
In those days, everybody smoked. Yeah.
Well, I'll go back. I didn't get a chance to hear from you about what you thought of working under Bob Rushworth. He was a really great guy. When I got to meet him, I'd love to hear what you have to say about him.
Yeah, Bob really was my mentor. When Bob White was reassigned from the Air Force Flight Test Center to, I believe he went to Germany and out there, I was really Bob White's replacement, so I was the new guy in the X-15. The Air Force had 2 pilots assigned to the X-15 program, and at that time they tried to have 2 Air Force guys and 2 NASA guys, and generally there was 1 or 2 other, whatever, sort of phasing in. And I think we had, at one time we had 6 pilots that were actively flying, which was, really more than you need for more often than you flew it. But Bob was a great mentor. He was quiet. He was an extremely good pilot. Had a great sense of humor. And I'm convinced that he probably led the way and paved the way to explain why I had rolled the airplane on the first flight and why it was okay thing to do, and I forever was beholden to Bob. So I think he was a great guy.
Yeah, Bob Rushworth is probably one of the least known pilots on the X-15, and yet you got to say he was the most successful. 34 flights in less than 6 years, an amazing guy. My favorite story, if you heard my own presentation yesterday, is that Bob White, who was the chief pilot at the time, when he brought Bob Rushworth on board, he ran into Paul Bickle and was complaining to Paul Bickle about Bob Rushworth coming on the program because Bob says, I offered him the job on the X-15 and he actually had to tell me he had to think about it. It's like, this is the X-15, of course I want to take this job. No, I got to think about it. I even got to go home and I got to ask my wife if it's okay with her. So he was very unassuming and he was just a really great guy. And out of all the guys that I went and interviewed, when I actually was able to go into their homes and sit down in their living room or whatever, Bob Rushworth is the only guy that I saw that you could tell he was from the X-15. He had his mementos and things up there. Pete Knight, he had one model of the X-15 sitting in the corner, but Bob Rushworth, boy, he loved that X-15 so much. Yeah.
One thing I remember about
baddies too. He had a gear come down on him at 4.4 Mach, and he had a windshield crack on it. And I don't know, he was going at altitude.
Oh yeah.
So you only have 2 glasses. One let go, you only had one eye then. It's lucky it was a right-hand pattern.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That thing that Charlie talks about was a flight that I'll never forget. It was after we had just rebuilt aircraft number 2 to make it into a Mach 8 airplane. It was the first flight out, and Bob was supposed to fly low altitude and just speed build up. And he launches from the B-52 and he gets from his chase, good life. And he starts routing off, it's Mach 1, Mach 2, Mach 3, Mach 4. And he says, the airplane's handling real nice. And then all of a sudden he says, I hear a bang. He says, I think my nose gear came out. And of course there's no chase planes around there at that time and there's nobody to see him. And he said, okay Bob, it's your opportunity. You want to eject, go ahead and jet. It's your call. And I thought, oh my God, that's the end of our program right there, because the airplane was just rebuilt, probably $9 million worth of expense went into it. I thought, man, this is not gonna be good. And then all of a sudden, Bob said, get me home, take me home. And they guided him back, and they said, Bob, your nose gear is gonna be disintegrated from the heat. You could bail out at any time. He said, no, just get me back to the base. And he comes in and he makes a perfect landing. Tires are all ripped up and stuff like that. And when the airplane stopped, his words were, thank you, Mr. North America. And I'll never forget that.
I've got an XLR 11 story that we had 3 flights in a row, and I think they started with either Pete Peterson or Rushworth and Neil Armstrong. 3 in a row, left turn, engine shut down. So, and this is maybe at risk with Charlie disagreeing with my memory, but
That's
Bickle
what we
did
have you guys up here, to keep each other honest.
Bickle grounded that airplane, and it was my job to find out why in the hell it shut the engine down. And so we started looking, tracing the wiring, going back from the cockpit to the switches that controlled the circuit back in there to the XLR-11 engine. And we started tearing the airplane apart. And I think it was on the ground for maybe a month. And we never could find it until some guy got smart enough to go through the wire bundle that went through the bulkhead. There was the wire short that actually caused the shutdown was 1 layer in on the bundle. And he found it. Do you remember that, Charlie? Was it your airplane? I lucked out.
Yeah. There you go, yeah, that's the other guy.
But the story reminds me of old Pete Peterson. He was quite a guy.
Oh, yes.
And when he left the program and wound up getting selected to be running for the contest with one other officer for going in as the exec officer on the Enterprise, I was in D.C. and he had just finished his 6 months under Rickover at Idaho Falls, training on the reactor. And so he told me, and this was an interesting story, which I'll go ahead and share with everybody.
Please.
Pete loved his boots. And one of the Air Force guys had taken him on, maybe 2 or 3 of them, to the officers club. And he had too much, and the general giving the speech that night. Have you heard this story, Joe?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, you can correct it. Anyway, Pete blurts out, "Bullshit, General," in the middle of his speech. And man, they got him out of there in a hurry. But anyway, based on that background, Pete told me on the phone the day after he got back to the Pentagon after serving under Rickover, he said, "Wayne," he says, "I haven't had a drink since I left, or at any rate," he says, "they had us on 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week at Idaho Falls, and that's what I'm facing here at the Pentagon." Well, it turns out he served as exec, and then later on went back and took over as skipper. But it was delayed a few months because of the Vietnam accident on the deck that destroyed a bunch of airplanes in Vietnam. Delayed that investigation of him taking over skipper. But then several years later, old Norm Foster gave me an emergency pilot kit to take and deliver to him because I had a meeting with his boss at the Pentagon, who was the Assistant Secretary for Research, who I met down in Santa Monica. And I took the kit that Norm gave me and gave it to Pete in his office there at the Pentagon.
Joe, did you want to talk about that at all? You said you were familiar with that incident. Anything you want to add?
Oh, no, I had just arrived at Edwards from George. Hadn't even started the school yet.
But you weren't there in the officers' club then?
Yes, I was.
You were? Well,
That was a dining in, where everybody in best dress and everything, and everybody's quiet and everything is very closely controlled at a dining in, at a military dining in. And like you say, I was sitting there, a young lieutenant, and the general from George Air Force Base, it had the wing at George, had the wing of F-100s and 104s, and George was the speaker, was the guest speaker. And protocol was very, very strict. And the general was talking about Southeast Asia or something. I'm not sure what he was talking about, but I hear this bullshit. And we got quiet for a minute, and then the general started talking again, and he said, "That's bullshit." And he did it about 3 times, and then he was helped out.
Were you surprised at his career after that?
No.
He had a good minute.
Oh, yeah. For those of you who aren't aware, Pete Peterson, the guy they're talking about, Forrest Peterson, was the only U.S. Navy pilot to fly on the X-15 program.
Navy admiral, Secretary of State or something.
Yeah.
Saved him all the time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Pete went on to a pretty darn good career eventually. And he was a really great guy. Another one of the guys I got to talk to and stuff. And
I think he retired as the third most senior admiral in the Navy as NAVAIR, head of NAVAIR.
yeah,
And then within a year or two after he retired, he died of a brain tumor.
yeah, I spoke to him right after he retired, and it's really amazing about the X-15 and the pilots, especially. We got 12 pilots of the X-15, and I think about half of them made it up to general or admiral rank. It was a pretty good career starter for a lot of you guys.
It was.
Yeah. Did you want to talk about that at all, Joe?
I don't know how it happened. I mean, I just laid low. I figured there wasn't anything better than flying the X-15. Seriously, I really didn't. And so anything after my X-15 flying, I just considered gravy as far as the career goes. I had reached what I consider to be the pinnacle in flying for a pilot.
Well, it's pretty neat when you think that the X-15 is considered even more so than flying into orbit on the space shuttle. You are the only pilot of the space shuttle program out of the 135 missions who was able to fly the space shuttle from orbit to landing manually, as I understand it. Because of your experience on the X-15, you were the only one they trusted to do that. Would you like to comment about that?
Again, I don't have any other comment other than that I was just grateful to have had the X-15 experience and to have flown it. And I do think that the X-15 program allowed us to get the space shuttle into the air much, much faster and quicker with more confidence than we could have imagined before. We learned things like energy management. We learned things like we could take an airplane with not a very good glide ratio. The wings were small on the space shuttle. They were small on the X-15. But the lift-to-drag ratio, which kind of tells you how shallow you can glide without power, was about the same on both airplanes, about 4.5 on both the X-15 and the space shuttle. We had, with F-104s, configuring them up to match the performance of the X-15, we used F-104s to practice approaches to the lake bed and to the uprange lake bed, some of which were not all that big and not that long, so you had to be very accurate in your energy management to come in and land and stop before you ran off the other end of the lake bed. At NASA, the management at NASA was very reluctant to accept the fact that you could fly an airplane with an L over D as low as the space shuttle was going to have, which was the same as the X-15, basically the same. They didn't think you really can't reliably fly an airplane back like that. And after several discussions of, well, we just finished the program, a program where we did it 199 times with the X-15 and showed them that the performance was essentially identical after you got down to about Mach 5 or 6. And you could make it back, and you didn't need guidance, and you didn't need air-breathing engines to shallow out the final approach glide. That you could do it as steep as you had to come in without engines. Again, I think that the X-15, one of the biggest contributions that the X-15 made, aside from all the systems, flight control systems and other systems that had to be developed, that the operations and the guidance and the navigation, the fact that the pilot could look out the window and bring an airplane back from Mach 6 and well in excess of 100,000 feet and consistently make accurate pinpoint landings where he wanted to touch down on the lake bed, helped us to get there, to get the space shuttle flying faster than we would have otherwise.
How was the space shuttle to fly. I'm sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, another thing that transfer of information from the X-15 was the reuse of a vehicle that would go into space and back. And they used a lot of information from the X-15, what we had to do to make it safe for another flight, what problems we had. Of course, a big problem was leakage. Among other things, and how about what do you do with the engines that you're going to reuse a rocket engine to show that it's safe for another launch. So all that information was transferred from the X-15 to the space shuttle to help them successfully reuse the machine.
Yeah, they were having turnaround of the shuttle was extended quite a bit, and we were asked, or three of us went down to Kennedy and followed STS-26 through processing, trying to put flight test procedures into shuttle procedures and try and cut some of the turnaround time out, which ended up helping the shuttle do a little quicker turnarounds when we show them how we did it and what we thought they were doing wrong. It wasn't accepted all the time, but we
I might make another comment on, we were talking about the pilot checkout. When Bill Dana was getting checked out, of course that was fairly, we were down to doing, not developing the airplane to its capability, but doing research flights for other experiments. Anyway, I was taking a class of some kind at that time, and people in the class said, well, what are you doing on the next flight, the X-15? Oh, that's just low and slow, we're checking out a new pilot. Well, what do you mean low and slow? And I said, oh, we're only going Mach 4.5 at 100 to 150,000. And I could tell by even though I considered that low and slow because of the experience with the airplane, the rest of the class, that wasn't low and slow.
Yeah, it's one thing that a lot of people don't understand about the X-15 is that it was the precursor for so much of what went into the manned space program. Suiting van, mission control idea, so many of these things came out of the development of the X-15 and went on. Yeah.
all kinds of good stuff.
Oh yeah, a lot of that stuff came from Walt Williams, because Walt Williams was the first head of this X-15 program, and he left, and when Paul Bickle took over and went and ran the Mercury program, so he took all of that with him to the Mercury program, which then of course extended to Gemini, Apollo.
He took some of our division chiefs with him.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's another story about Walt. He was in an X-15 post-flight meeting the very day after they launched Ham before Shepard went. And he told a wonderful story I'll never forget, and that was that Ham had learned to beat the software guys that had designed the banana chip machine that he would get his chips out. And they thought they had exposed him to all the hazards on the Redstone launch, but they forgot one hazard, and that was the escape rocket going off when they had a successful launch. And so they had a film of him in the capsule, so when he got scared, he stopped doing the shortcut and started getting his chips the way he was trained. And I studied all the papers in NASA written by thousands of pages on the chip training, and never mentioned once about him having beat and developed a shortcut to get his chips out. But Walt told that story the day after the launch in our post-flight meeting.
Thank you. Has there been anybody else that wanted to answer a question?
One quick last
Yeah.
one. Orbital, were you guys, anybody on the panel here involved in any of the prelim to make this aircraft orbital? Were you questioned, or is there anything about it that you could share?
Well, I do know one thing about the X-15. Talked about launching it from a B-70, and then we realized we didn't have enough life support space in the airplane to survive a flight like that, so they discontinued the thought.
The carry-on program, which they canceled, was a dinosaur. And that one was gonna be once around.
Wasn't there consideration with it being mounted vertical to a Titan or an Atlas or something like that?
Oh, they had all kinds of ideas.
Yeah.
There was a lot to be on top of a Titan.
Yeah.
And the guy that invented the dinosaur was the VP of Bell when I was working there and used to use his office. When he was working half-time, but it was Walter Dornberger. He was the Nazi general that was von Braun's boss in Newby. But Boeing had given him a huge painting of the dinosaur re-entering the Earth. And Boeing had a big brass plaque on this painting they'd given Dornberger, and it said, born 1950-something, Walter Dornberger, died Mac the Knife, 1963. That was for Mac McLaren.
I got a little story about von Braun came out and was looking at our X-15, and our chests are all puffed up because we got the greatest thing around. So he walks around the front, and we have a 3-axis ball in front. Bob, he had that on the B-1. We walk back, these are reaction control motors in the wings and we had that on the B2. We went back and this is our engine, this is a big, we threw that design out.
The X-15, I think you were talking about orbit or something, but anyway, the heat protection in it was thermal heat sink. The leading edges, for instance, were very thick and heavy metal, much thicker than you needed for strength. But this was so that it would take a period of time for them to get hot enough to be damaged. And they were designed to get it to Mach 6 for a certain, interval of flight. That's why with the Chip 2, after the modification that would go to Mach 8, had to have the thermal protection system added to it, the ablative material, because the heat sink that was there would not get it to that speed safely.
Yeah, Pete took Chip 2 out. We got 1,325 degrees in buckled wings because of the leading edge was solid and it didn't expand as much as the Inconel, which was the surface of the wing. So it came back all buckled up. Good old North American had a Dutchman down there that was an auto-body guy, and he came up there with clamps and a beanbag and a little auto-body hammer. And he shrunk that whole wing, all of the extrusions up, he shrank that metal right back down to where it was. Then we cut the leading edge and made where it would expand with the wing.
Yeah, the expansion joints they added in the wing. And if you look at it in the museum, the expansion joints are there and they're covered with a thin Inconel sheet over them for airflow, but it's only welded on one side, so it can move.
I know we've gotten our 5-minute warning, so we're getting close to the end here. I want to ask Harry, as a North American aviation engineer, you were heavily involved in what was called the X-15A2, the advanced X-15. It was rebuilt after Jack McKay rolled over in November 1962. What were some of the challenges of working on what is still the only hypersonic research aircraft that has ever been built? You helped design and make that thing fly at North America. I'd like to have your comments about that, if you would.
Well, I was involved with designing the ejection and recovery system of the fuel tanks. And again, I used the information I knew about. I used relays and latching relays, pressure switches and batteries and stuff like that. And what we did is we designed a system where you had three buttons in the cockpit. One was a green one, that was meant when you push that button, you ejected the tanks empty. Then you had a black button that said they were partially empty, and a red button that said they were full. The difference was with the red button, the tanks dropped away just by gravity. With a dry tank, you had to blow it away, so there was a thruster involved. Internal of the tank was explosive squibs. These were little canisters that were filled with dynamite with two uninsulated wires that were embedded in the dynamite, and you would energize them with 28 volts, and they would cause the explosion and blow the thing apart. They even had bolts that had this inside of the bolts bored out and filled with dynamite, same way, explosive bolts. And the thrusters were the same way. So we designed a sequence on the drop tanks so that when you push the, let's say the green button, the tank would separate from the airplane by these thrusters, squibs, and then it would ignite, after it reached a certain altitude, it would ignite the thruster to push it away from the airplane. And then later on, it would send out a little door that pulled out a drogue chute, and then it would release that drogue chute, and then secondly after that, the nose cone would come off and the parachute would come out. Then when the tank hit the ground, to protect it, because we're going to reuse it, we had what we call whisker switches that when they hit the ground, they were supposed to release the parachute so the tank would not be dragged across the desert. Of course, the switches were located in the back of the tank, assuming it was going to land on the bottom. On one flight, they didn't get made it, so the tank was dragged across the desert a little bit, but still was reusable. But everything we made in there was relay logic. Nothing was computerized or anything like that. We used just what was off the shelf, and it seemed to work fine. But when we were designing it, there was another engineer, a fellow by the name of Cleve Kimball, and he was doing the fuel system. He was designing the fuel transfer system from the tanks to the airplane. It was this valve called the moderator valve. It was like a iris on a camera. And I asked him, I said, Cleve, aren't you worried that your design's not going to work? And he told me, he says, you know, this is only a $9 million airplane. I have a $90 million B-70 that I'm doing the fuel system on. That's what I'm worried about. But everything worked fine. All the systems worked good.
Thank you, Harry. And I want to say thank you to everyone that has come here today. Thank you to the audience and stuff. I wish we could talk for another few days up here, but we've been given the cut it off response, so we have to take our time and clear the room for everyone. Thank you so much for being here for the first ever X-15 panel. I hope that we will come back and do this again in the future as well. So please have a great rest of the Space Fest. Thank you for yes, I thank you for
Any chance of getting a copy?
yeah.
I'm not sure. This is that was good. Where you gotta go? All right. Yeah.